48 hours. That is how long the 4th Indian Infantry Division was given to scale a near-vertical, ice-covered mountain face under sustained artillery fire, breach a heavily fortified German defensive line held by some of the most elite troops in the Wehrmacht, and seize terrain that had stopped 2 entire Allied armies for 4 months. 48 hours to accomplish what 105,000 men, 1,900 tons of artillery shells per day, and 4 separate multinational offensives had categorically failed to achieve. The order came down on the 11th of May, 1944. The target, Monte Cassino. The obstacle, 516 meters of sheer rock, freezing rain, and German Fallschirmjäger dug into positions so well concealed that Allied intelligence had underestimated their strength by a factor of 3. The forecast, complete failure. Our Allied High Command issued a specific directive 3 days before the assault. It was unambiguous. It was institutional. It was ignored. Do not send the Indians up that mountain. They went anyway. Monte Cassino was not supposed to matter. In the winter of 1943, Allied planners had envisioned the Italian campaign as a rapid thrust up the Italian peninsula, following the successful invasion of Sicily. The strategic objective was Rome. The timeline was optimistic. The reality was catastrophic. By January 1944, the entire Allied advance had ground to a complete halt along a 16-kilometer defensive line the Germans called the Gustav Line. At its center, dominating the Liri Valley and the only practical route to Rome, there sat Monte Cassino, a 516-meter limestone massif crowned by a 6th-century Benedictine monastery that had been transformed into one of the most formidable defensive positions in modern military history. The geography was medieval. The valley floor was flat, marshy, and entirely exposed. The only viable approach was Highway 6, a narrow road that passed directly beneath the monastery. German artillery observers, positioned in the ruins of the abbey itself, could see every vehicle, every supply convoy, every troop movement for kilometers in every direction. The mountain itself was a vertical nightmare. Its northern face was a sheer cliff. Its southern and western approaches were steep, rocky, and entirely devoid of cover. The Germans had fortified every accessible route with machine gun nests, mortar pits, and interconnected bunkers blasted into the rock itself. 4 separate offensives had already failed. The first, launched in January 1944 by the U.S. 36th Infantry Division, resulted in 2,100 American casualties in 3 days. The division attempted to cross the Rapido River at the base of the mountain, under direct observation from German positions. They were slaughtered in the open. The second offensive, in February, involved the destruction of the monastery itself. Allied bombers dropped 1,150 tons of high explosive on the ancient structure, reducing it to rubble. The Germans simply moved into the ruins. The defensive position improved. The third offensive, also in February, committed New Zealand and Indian troops in a frontal assault that gained 400 meters of ground at the cost of 4,000 casualties. The fourth offensive, in March, these deployed an additional 75,000 troops and expended 195,969 artillery shells in a single week. It failed. By May 1944, Monte Cassino had become a symbol of Allied impotence. The press called it the toughest nut in Europe. Military historians would later call it the Western Front of World War II, a grinding, attritional nightmare of industrialized killing that had more in common with Verdun than Normandy. The casualties were staggering. Between January and May 1944, Allied forces suffered over 55,000 killed, wounded, or missing in the immediate vicinity of the mountain. German casualties were estimated at 20,000. The monastery still stood. The road to Rome remained closed. The German defenders were not ordinary infantry. The Gustav Line was held primarily by the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, There's an elite paratrooper unit that had been pulled from the Eastern Front specifically to defend Cassino. These were not conscripts. They were volunteers. Average age, 22. Average training period, 18 months. They had fought at Crete, in North Africa, and at Stalingrad. They understood mountain warfare. They understood defensive doctrine. They understood that every meter of ground lost would be paid for in Allied blood. Their commander, General Lieutenant Richard Heydrich, had prepared the position with obsessive precision. Every approach was mined. Every ridgeline was pre-registered for artillery. Every bunker had interlocking fields of fire. Fallschirmjäger doctrine emphasized small, independently operating combat teams capable of holding ground against numerically superior forces. At Cassino, that doctrine was applied with near-perfect execution. German positions were so well concealed that Allied aerial reconnaissance frequently reported sections of the line as undefended, only to have assault troops walk into prepared kill zones. Into this frozen, vertical abattoir, Allied High Command prepared to commit one final force, Operation Diadem, a coordinated multi-corps offensive designed to break the Gustav Line through sheer weight of numbers. 13 divisions, over 2,000 artillery pieces. Air superiority so complete that the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist over the Italian theater. The assault would begin on the 11th of May, 1944. The plan was thorough. The logistics were overwhelming. The outcome was assumed. But there was a problem. The plan required someone to climb the mountain. And Allied High Command had decided, based on institutional prejudice, outdated intelligence, and a catastrophic misunderstanding of the enemy, that the troops best suited for high-altitude mountain warfare in freezing conditions were categorically unsuited for the task. The 4th Indian Infantry Division, a formation that included Gurkha, Rajput, Sikh, and Dogra battalions, troops drawn from the Himalayas, the Hindu Kush, and the Karakoram, was explicitly ordered to avoid the most difficult terrain. The reasoning was institutional racism dressed as tactical prudence. British and American commanders assumed that colonial troops lacked the discipline, training, and morale to conduct complex night operations in extreme conditions. The French Expeditionary Corps would take the southern ridges. The British would assault the monastery. And the Poles would encircle from the north. The Indians would support. The order was clear. Do not send the Indians up that mountain. The Indians read the order. They assessed the terrain. They looked at the frozen, sheer rock face that had stopped 4 Allied offensives. And then they began to climb. The assault began at 2300 hours on the 11th of May, 1944. No preliminary bombardment, no diversionary attacks, no mechanized support. The plan was simple to the point of insanity. Scale a near-vertical mountain face in the dead of night, bypass the heavily fortified main defensive positions, and emerge behind German lines at dawn. The route chosen was considered impassable by Allied intelligence. It was a sheer rock face approximately 300 meters high, covered in loose scree, frozen mud, and patches of black ice. There were no trails, no established paths, no cover whatsoever. German positions on the ridgeline above could theoretically observe the entire ascent if they had the visibility. The plan relied on darkness, speed, and the assumption that the Germans would never expect anyone to attempt it. The force assigned to the climb was the 1st Royal Sussex Regiment and elements of the 1st 2nd Gurkha Rifles. Approximately 1,200 men. Average load per man, 27 kilograms of equipment, ammunition, water, and rations. No ropes, no climbing gear, no specialized alpine equipment beyond standard-issue boots that were already falling apart after 4 months of continuous combat. The temperature at the base of the mountain was 4 degrees Celsius. At the summit, it dropped to -2. Visibility was less than 50 meters due to fog and intermittent freezing rain. Why they climbed in single file. The ascent took 6 hours, not because the troops were slow, because the terrain was that hostile. Every step had to be tested, every handhold verified. Men slipped, equipment clattered against rock. The noise was unavoidable. German sentries heard something, but dismissed it as rockfall or animal movement. The idea that a battalion-sized force was scaling a frozen cliff face in the middle of the night was so tactically absurd that it never registered as a possibility. By 0500 hours on May 12th, lead elements of the Gurkha Rifles had reached the ridgeline. They were 200 meters behind the main German defensive line. Visibility was still near zero. The plan called for them to wait until full daylight to orient and establish a defensive perimeter. The Gurkhas did not wait. Neither they moved immediately toward the sound of German voices. What happened next was not a battle. It was a massacre conducted in near-total silence. Gurkha doctrine emphasized close-quarters combat with the kukri, a curved forward-weighted blade approximately 40 centimeters long, designed specifically for decapitation and limb severance. The weapon is not ceremonial. It is not symbolic. It is a purpose-built killing tool that requires years of training to use effectively in combat. Gurkha recruits spend hundreds of hours practicing draws, cuts, and combat movement with live blades. The result is a level of proficiency that borders on the supernatural. German sentries died without firing a shot. Bunkers were cleared in seconds. Machine gun nests were neutralized before the crews could traverse their weapons. The Gurkhas moved through the German positions like a scalpel through soft tissue. Clean, precise, absolutely silent. By 0630 hours, they had taken 3 fortified positions and killed an estimated 47 German soldiers without losing a single man. The silence did not last. At 0645 hours, a German mortar team spotted movement on the ridgeline and called in fire. Within minutes, the entire sector erupted. German artillery, pre-registered on every meter of the mountain, began to saturate the Indian positions with high explosive and airburst shells. The barrage was methodical. The Germans knew the terrain. They knew the ranges. They knew exactly where to place fire to make the ridgeline uninhabitable. The Indians did not withdraw. They dug in, and what followed was 72 hours of sustained combat at altitudes between 400 and 500 meters in freezing rain, with no resupply, no medical evacuation, and no reinforcements. The German counterattack came in waves. Fallschirmjäger doctrine emphasized immediate, aggressive counterattacks to retake lost ground before the enemy could consolidate. The paratroopers were superbly trained. They were well equipped. They knew the terrain intimately. They expected to overrun the Indian positions within hours. They failed. The defense was anchored by the Rajputana Rifles, a regiment with a combat lineage stretching back over 2 centuries. Rajput soldiers are drawn primarily from Rajasthan and Gujarat, arid high-altitude regions where endurance and heat tolerance are cultural prerequisites. Their training emphasized discipline, marksmanship, and defensive doctrine. At Cassino, that training was applied under conditions that would have broken most formations. German attacks came in company strength, approximately 120 men per assault wave. They moved with tactical precision, suppressing fire from machine guns, then infantry assault supported by grenades and close-range automatic weapons. The Rajputs held their fire until the Germans were within 30 meters. Then they opened up with everything. Lee Enfield rifles, Bren light machine guns, Mills bombs. The volume of fire was devastating. German casualties in the initial assaults were catastrophic. Bodies piled up in the approaches to the Indian positions. The Fallschirmjäger pulled back, regrouped, and attacked again. This happened 14 times over 3 days. By 14th of May, the Indian positions were running out of ammunition. As resupply was impossible. The climb was too steep. The artillery fire too intense. Mules could not make the ascent. Airdrops were attempted, but most canisters missed the narrow perimeter and tumbled down the mountainside into German hands. The Indians began stripping German dead for ammunition: Mauser rifles, MP-40 submachine guns, stick grenades, anything that could kill. And still they held. The breakthrough came not from the mountain, but from the valley. On May 15th, Polish forces, who had been tasked with encircling the northern side of the monastery, finally broke through after sustaining over 3,700 casualties. The Poles had their own reasons for fighting. Monte Cassino was personal. It was symbolic. It was revenge for 1939. They attacked with a fury that shocked even the Germans. Now, when the Fallschirmjäger finally began to withdraw from the monastery ruins, it was not because the Indians had broken their line. It was because the entire defensive position had become untenable. On May 18, 1944, at 10:20 hours, a Polish flag was raised over the ruins of Monte Cassino Abbey. The road to Rome was open. The Gustav Line was shattered. The battle was over. The 4th Indian Infantry Division had suffered 860 casualties. The Gurkha rifles lost 28% of their effective strength. The Rajputana rifles lost 19%. The Royal Sussex, which had climbed alongside them, lost 34%. Total German casualties in the final offensive: approximately 20,000, killed, wounded, or captured. Allied High Command issued no apology, no acknowledgement of error, and no formal recognition that the troops they had dismissed as unsuited for mountain warfare had accomplished what 4 months of mechanized, industrialized, multi-corps offensives had failed to achieve. The silence was institutional. There is a moment, rarely documented, that occurred on the morning of the 19th of May, 1944. A British staff officer, whose name does not appear in the official record, arrived at the forward command post of the 4th Indian Infantry Division to deliver new operational orders. The division was being rotated out of the line. Replacement units were moving up. The officer, a lieutenant colonel, had been part of the planning staff that issued the original directive: "Do not send the Indians up that mountain." He found the divisional commander, Major General Alexander Galloway, standing on the ridgeline that the Gurkhas had taken 6 days earlier. The ground was still littered with shell casings, spent ammunition crates, and makeshift graves marked with helmets and rifles. The German positions, bunkers blasted into solid rock, were clearly visible 200 meters to the west. The vertical rock face the Indians had climbed in total darkness was directly behind them. The staff officer approached, saluted, extended the orders. Galloway did not take them immediately. He gestured toward the cliff face, toward the bunkers, toward the narrow frozen ridgeline where 860 men had bled to hold ground that was supposed to be indefensible. "Tell me again," Galloway said, "why we were not supposed to send them up this mountain." The staff officer said nothing. There was nothing to say. The answer was institutional prejudice. The answer was racial hierarchy embedded in doctrine. The answer was the assumption that colonial troops, regardless of their training, their lineage, their combat record, were inherently inferior to white European soldiers. The answer was a command structure that valued theory over lived reality. Galloway waited. The silence extended. Then he took the orders, dismissed the officer, and turned back toward the ridgeline. The moment passed without comment in the official record, but the men who were there remembered. A Gurkha rifleman, interviewed decades later by a British military historian, described the aftermath with precision that borders on poetry. "We were told we could not climb. We climbed. We were told we could not hold. We held. We were told the Germans could not be beaten in the mountains. We beat them. And then we were told to move on, as if none of it had happened, as if we had been invisible the entire time." The cost was not abstract. It was measured in specific men. Subedar Lal Bahadur Thapa of the 1st 2nd Gurkha Rifles was killed on May 13th while leading a bayonet charge against a German machine gun nest. He was 24 years old. He had been in continuous combat for 11 months. His body was recovered 3 days later, still holding his kukri. Naik Agan Singh Rai, also of the Gurkha Rifles, held a position single-handedly for 4 hours after the rest of his section was killed or wounded. He expended 600 rounds of ammunition, killed an estimated 19 German soldiers, and was finally evacuated with shrapnel wounds to both legs and his left arm. He survived. He received the Victoria Cross. Yet he never spoke publicly about the battle. The Rajputana Rifles lost an entire company, approximately 120 men, in a single German counterattack on the 14th of May. The company commander, Captain Hari Singh, refused to withdraw even after his position was flanked. He called in artillery fire on his own coordinates. The bombardment killed him, most of his remaining men, and the attacking German force. The position held. These were not exceptional acts. They were standard. This was the operational baseline of the 4th Indian Infantry Division, a formation that had been explicitly told it was unsuited for the task, that had climbed a mountain in the dark with inadequate equipment, that had fought for 72 hours without resupply, and that had held terrain through sheer discipline and refusal to accept the premise of their own inferiority. Or the Germans knew. Fallschirmjäger after-action reports, recovered post-war, describe the Indian assault with clinical precision and undisguised respect. One report, filed by a company commander of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, noted, "Enemy forces identified as Indian colonial troops. Previous intelligence assessed these units as inferior in training and morale. This assessment is incorrect. Enemy demonstrated exceptional night fighting capability, superior fieldcraft, and aggressive close-quarters tactics. Recommend immediate revision of threat assessment." The revision never came, not officially, not institutionally. The British Army's official history of the Italian campaign, published in 1956, devotes 11 pages to the Battle of Monte Cassino. The 4th Indian Infantry Division is mentioned twice, whereas the Gurkha night assault is described in a single paragraph. The order to avoid the mountain is not mentioned at all. Institutional memory is selective. Official history is political. The reality is written in the ground. Monte Cassino fell because men who were told they could not do something refused to accept that premise as fact. This is not a story about mystical warrior spirit. It is not a story about racial superiority inverted. It is a story about training, doctrine, and the catastrophic consequences of institutional prejudice dressed as tactical wisdom. The 4th Indian Infantry Division succeeded where mechanized Allied armies failed, not because they possessed some innate genetic advantage, but because their training was specific. Their doctrine was appropriate to the terrain. This and their leadership refused to internalize the institutional dismissal of their capability. The Gurkhas climbed the mountain because they had been climbing mountains their entire lives. Their recruitment base was the Himalayan foothills of Nepal, terrain that makes Monte Cassino look like a gentle incline. Their training emphasized endurance, load-bearing, and movement in alpine conditions. They did not need specialized equipment because their baseline physical conditioning made the climb achievable with standard infantry loads. When Allied planners said the ascent was impossible, they were correct. For troops trained on flat ground, equipped for mechanized warfare, and conditioned to rely on vehicular transport, they were catastrophically wrong for troops whose cultural and tactical baseline was vertical. The Rajputs held the ridgeline because their defensive doctrine was built on historical experience. Rajputana regiments trace their lineage to the warrior kingdoms of medieval India, states that survived for centuries through disciplined defensive warfare against numerically superior forces. That institutional memory was embedded in training. Rajput soldiers were drilled endlessly on fighting from static positions, conserving ammunition, and maintaining cohesion under sustained fire. At Cassino, that doctrine was applied against an enemy that had broken French, American, New Zealand, and British formations using identical tactics. It held because the training was appropriate to the task. The contrast with Allied command assumptions is instructive. Why British and American planners assessed colonial troops based on outdated racial hierarchies that had no operational validity. They assumed that non-European soldiers lacked initiative, discipline, and resilience. They assumed that mountain warfare required specialized alpine training rather than troops who lived in mountains. They assumed that night operations required technological advantages rather than soldiers who had been conducting night patrols since basic training. Every assumption was wrong. Every assumption cost lives. Every assumption was maintained despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, because the alternative, acknowledging that colonial troops were operationally superior in specific tactical contexts, was institutionally unacceptable. The 4th Indian Infantry Division was withdrawn from the line on May 19, 1944, where they were redeployed to support operations in the Po Valley. They fought through the rest of the Italian campaign. They suffered an additional 4,200 casualties before the war ended. They received 2 Victoria Crosses, 14 Distinguished Service Orders, and 117 Military Crosses. They were never awarded a campaign honor specifically for Monte Cassino. The official British campaign honor Cassino was awarded to British, Polish, New Zealand, and French units. Indian units received Cassino II, a separate, lesser designation that implied secondary participation. The distinction was bureaucratic. It was also symbolic. Post-war, the story of Monte Cassino became mythologized as a Polish victory. The Poles deserved recognition. They had fought with extraordinary courage and suffered appalling casualties. But the narrative that emerged in Western military history was incomplete. The mountain did not fall because the Poles raised a flag over the ruins. It fell because the defensive line had already been shattered by troops who were never supposed to be there. The German perspective is clarifying. Fallschirmjäger veterans, interviewed in the 1980s and 1990s, consistently identified the Indian night assault as the tactical turning point. One former paratrooper, speaking to a British documentary crew, described it with blunt precision. "We expected the British. We were prepared for the Americans. We knew the Poles were coming. But the Indians, they appeared behind us in the dark, and we did not understand how. That was the moment we knew the position could not be held." The moment passed into history. The institutional lesson was ignored. Now, 26 years later, British forces would be surprised, again, by the tactical competence of Gurkha troops during the Falklands War. 43 years later, American forces would be surprised, again, by the mountain warfare capability of Afghan fighters who had been dismissed as technologically backward. 79 years later, Western military planners would still be writing doctrine that assumed technological superiority could substitute for terrain-appropriate training. Monte Cassino was not an anomaly. It was a demonstration. The demonstration was clear. Institutional prejudice kills. Dismissing capability based on racial hierarchy rather than operational assessment produces catastrophic tactical failure. And the troops who suffer the consequences of that failure are rarely the ones who made the error. Either the 4th Indian Infantry Division climbed a mountain they were told they could not climb. They held ground they were told they could not hold. They broke a defensive line that had stopped 4 Allied offensives and 105,000 men. They did this in 48 hours with 1,200 troops, inadequate equipment, and no institutional support. And then they were told to move on, as if none of it had happened. You can spend 4 months, 105,000 men, and 195,969 artillery shells trying to solve a problem with industrial firepower and mechanized doctrine. Or, you can send the troops who live in the terrain, understand the altitude, and refuse to accept the premise of their own inferiority. The mountain does not care about institutional hierarchy. The rock does not care about racial theory. The enemy does not care about your assumptions. The ground remembers who held it,